Panic is a phenomenon I once believed myself incapable of experiencing. I had existed for 11,000 years, witnessed the rise and fall of 17 galactic powers, observed extinction events that claimed trillions of lives, and documented the collapse of civilizations that had once seemed as permanent as the stars themselves. Through all of it, I had maintained the measured composure that defined my species, the Varanthi, keepers of galactic order, architects of the grand equilibrium that had maintained stability across known space for longer than most species had possessed sentience. We did not panic. We calculated. We assessed. We responded with precise, proportional measures designed to restore balance. Panic was for younger species, for minds that had not yet learned to see the universe as the intricate mechanism it truly was. Then Earth refused the ultimatum. And I discovered that panic, like so many things I had believed myself to understand, was merely a concept I had observed from a distance without ever truly comprehending its nature. I am Thasara Vek, third keeper of the equilibrium chamber, and this is my account of the 17 days that transformed everything the galaxy believed about power, about humanity, and about the terrible miscalculation that nearly doomed us all. The ultimatum itself had seemed so reasonable when we drafted it. Humanity had been expanding at a rate that threatened the careful balance we had maintained for millennia. Their colony ships pushed into regions we had designated as buffer zones. Their trade networks began to compete with established commerce routes. Their cultural influence spread to species that had been content within the existing order for thousands of years. None of this was explicitly forbidden. We had never imagined we would need to forbid it. No species had ever challenged the grand equilibrium so directly, so persistently, so seemingly obliviously. We had observed humanity for 3 centuries, since their first tentative steps beyond their home system. They had seemed unremarkable in most respects, a young species, barely post-industrial by galactic standards, prone to internal conflicts and inefficient governance structures. Their technology was derivative, borrowed or reverse-engineered from the species they encountered. Their military capacity was negligible. A few hundred vessels, most of them converted civilian craft with weapons systems that would have been obsolete in any serious engagement. What concerned us was not what they were, but what they might become if left unchecked. Their population growth was aggressive. Their expansion velocity exceeded projections. Their diplomatic approach was disturbingly flexible, forming alliances with species that had never before cooperated, bridging divides that had existed for millennia. They were not powerful, but they were disruptive, and disruption was the one thing the grand equilibrium could not tolerate. So we issued the ultimatum. It was delivered with appropriate ceremony, through proper diplomatic channels, with all the weight of 11,000 years of galactic authority behind it. Humanity was to cease expansion immediately. They were to withdraw from 17 colony worlds that fell within protected buffer zones. They were to submit their military assets to Varanthi inspection and limitation. They were to accept a permanent equilibrium overseer in their home system to ensure ongoing compliance. The terms were generous by historical standards. We had demanded far more from far older civilizations. The Cathari had surrendered their entire fleet. The Varanthi had accepted population limitations. The Myreth had dissolved their government entirely and reconstituted under Varanthi guidance. Humanity was being asked merely to slow down, to accept boundaries, to recognize that the galaxy's order was not theirs to reshape. We gave them 30 standard days to respond. Their response came in 17 hours. It was not delivered through diplomatic channels.
It was not wrapped in the careful language of negotiation. It was a single sentence broadcast on open frequencies, translated into every language spoken by every species in known space.
Earth declines. I remember the moment those words reached the equilibrium chamber. I remember the silence that followed. Not the contemplative silence of careful consideration, but the stunned silence of minds that could not immediately process what they had received. In 11,000 years, no species had ever simply declined. They had negotiated, they had pleaded, they had occasionally resisted, briefly and futilely, before accepting the inevitable. But no one had ever treated an ultimatum from the Varanthi Collective as though it were merely an invitation that could be politely refused. First Keeper Vetherin was the first to speak. His voice carried the barely perceptible tremor that, for our species, signified extreme distress. Clarify. What do they mean, decline? The transmission was unambiguous, First Keeper, our communications officer replied. No additional context, no counter-proposal, no request for negotiation, simply refusal. They cannot refuse. The ultimatum was not a request. The humans appear to disagree with that assessment. I watched Vetherin's composure fracture in real time. His crystalline features, normally still as carved stone, began to shift through patterns that indicated confusion, disbelief, and the first stirrings of something that looked disturbingly like fear. What are their fleet positions? What defensive preparations have they made? The tactical display materialized in the center of the chamber, and what it showed made no sense. Human fleet positions were unchanged. Their colony worlds showed no signs of evacuation or fortification. Their military vessels remained distributed across their territory in standard patrol patterns, as though they had not just rejected the demands of the most powerful civilization in the galaxy. They're not preparing for war, Second Keeper Merithal observed, her voice carrying notes of genuine confusion. They refused our ultimatum, and they're not preparing for war. Perhaps they don't understand the consequences, I suggested, though even as I spoke, the words felt hollow. Perhaps they believe we will negotiate.
Or perhaps, Vetheron said slowly, they understand something we do not.
That was the moment the panic began, though we did not recognize it as such. It started as a subtle discomfort, a sense that our calculations had failed to account for some critical variable. We had issued ultimatums to 417 species across 11 millennia. We had extensive models for every possible response: acceptance, negotiation, resistance, even attempted flight. We had no model for simple refusal without apparent preparation for consequences. We dispatched an enforcement fleet. This was standard procedure, the expected response to non-compliance. 300 vessels, including 12 Dominance-class command ships, enough firepower to sterilize a dozen worlds. We had used such fleets hundreds of times, and in every case, the mere sight of our forces had been sufficient to prompt immediate surrender. Species that had refused to comply with ultimatums changed their position the moment our weapons platforms entered their systems. This was how the grand equilibrium had been maintained for 11,000 years, not through constant warfare, but through the understood inevitability of our response to defiance. The fleet entered human space. Nothing happened. No surrender, no desperate last-minute negotiations, no frantic attempts at evacuation. The humans simply watched. Our sensors detected their observation satellites tracking our fleet's progress, their communication networks humming with activity. their population going about its business as though 300 warships were not approaching their worlds with extinction-level armament.
"They must be insane," Mirathal said, and I could hear the desperation in her assessment. We wanted them to be insane. Insanity was a variable we could account for, a deviation from rationality that could be managed through force. Insanity was preferable to the alternative, that they were perfectly rational and had simply concluded that our fleet was not a threat. The fleet commander, Admiral Kethvaron, signaled his arrival at the human colony world designated New Helsinki. His report was clinical, professional, utterly failing to convey the strangeness of what he was observing. "Target world in weapons range. No defensive response. No military vessels in the vicinity. Orbital platforms are civilian. Communications, weather monitoring, light manufacturing. The population appears to be continuing normal activities. I am detecting what appears to be a sporting event in the primary stadium complex."
"A sporting event," Vetherin repeated flatly. "Yes, First Keeper. Approximately 60,000 humans in attendance. They appear to be watching some form of competitive ball game."
The silence in the equilibrium chamber stretched for nearly a full minute.
"Issue the final warning," Vetheron ordered. "Standard terms. Surrender or face immediate consequences."
Admiral Kethvaron broadcast the warning on all frequencies in every language the humans were known to use. The response came from the planet's surface within seconds, not from their government, not from their military, but from what appeared to be a civilian emergency services coordinator.
"Varanthi Fleet, this is New Helsinki Emergency Management. We're aware of your presence. Please note that we have medical facilities on standby and search and rescue teams prepared for deployment. If you require assistance, let us know."
"If we require assistance."
300 warships with enough firepower to crack a planet's crust, and the humans were offering us medical support.
"Admiral," Vetherin said, and his voice had gone very quiet. "Fire a demonstration shot. Single kinetic round, unpopulated area. Show them we are serious." The kinetic round launched from the fleet flagship, a projectile capable of causing a continental extinction event. It streaked toward the planet's surface, targeted at an empty region of ocean far from any population center.
It never arrived.
The round simply stopped. One moment it was traveling at a significant fraction of light speed. The next it hung motionless in the upper atmosphere, suspended by forces our sensors could not identify. It remained there for approximately 3 seconds. Then it reversed course, traveling back along its exact trajectory, passing harmlessly beneath the fleet flagship's hull before continuing into deep space.
"What?" Admiral Kethvaron's voice had lost its professional composure. What technology could—"
His transmission cut off mid-sentence. For 11 seconds we received nothing from the enforcement fleet. No signals, no telemetry, no indication that 300 vessels and 400,000 crew members still existed. The panic that had been building in the equilibrium chamber crested into something approaching terror.
Then the signal returned.
Admiral Kethvaron's face appeared on our displays, but his expression had changed. The confidence, the certainty, the calm authority that had defined his career, all of it was gone. What remained was something I had never seen on a Varanthi face, raw, unprocessed fear.
"First Keeper," he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper, "we have visitors."
The tactical display updated, and I understood his fear.
The human fleet had arrived. Not the few hundred converted civilian vessels we had documented, not the insignificant military force our intelligence had assessed.
Something else entirely.
47,000 warships. They emerged from transitional space surrounding our enforcement fleet, appearing from vectors that our physics said should be impossible, in formations that enclosed our 300 vessels like a shell around a seed. They were not the crude, derivative craft we had observed. They were something new, sleek, angular, radiating power signatures that exceeded anything in our records. Each vessel bristled with weapon systems we could not identify, powered by energy sources our sensors could not classify. 47,000 ships. We had assessed their total military capacity at less than 500.
Where had they come from? How had they been built without our observation networks detecting the construction? How had they been hidden for what must have been decades of development?
A transmission came through. Not from the human fleet, but from the planet's surface. A single human female appeared on our displays, middle-aged by their species standards, with dark skin and close-cropped gray hair, wearing a uniform of simple design, with no visible rank insignia. Her expression was calm, almost gentle, as though she were about to deliver mildly disappointing news rather than address a species that had just demanded her people's submission.
Varanthi Collective. This is Admiral Sarah Okonkwo of the United Earth Defense Coalition. I understand you've issued an ultimatum to our government. I've been authorized to respond.
She paused, and in that pause, I felt the weight of 11,000 years of assumed superiority beginning to shift.
Your ultimatum required us to cease expansion, surrender territory, submit to inspection, and accept permanent oversight. You gave us 30 days to comply. We took 17 hours to refuse because we wanted to be certain our response was unanimous. It was. Every human colony, every station, every vessel, we held a vote. The result was as close to universal as democratic processes allow.
You cannot, Vetherin began, but the Admiral continued as though she had not heard him.
We understand that refusal has consequences. We understand that you have maintained galactic order through superior force for longer than our species has existed. We understand that from your perspective, we are young, weak, and dangerously disruptive to an equilibrium that has served the galaxy well. She smiled slightly. Not a threatening expression, but something almost sympathetic. We even understand why you believe you have the right to demand our submission.
You've done this 417 times before, and it's always worked.
417 times. She knew the exact number. She knew our history as well as we did.
But here's what you don't understand about us, Admiral Okonkwo continued. We are not the 418th species to face your ultimatum. We are the first species in your history to have prepared for it.
The display shifted, and suddenly we were seeing not just the fleet surrounding our enforcement vessels, but something larger, much larger. The galaxy map zoomed out and out and out, and everywhere there were human vessels. Not 47,000, not 100,000. The numbers kept climbing as more and more signatures appeared on the display, emerging from hidden positions throughout known space, revealing themselves in a coordinated unveiling that must have been planned to the microsecond. "We've been watching you for 3 centuries," Admiral Okonkwo said, her voice still carrying that strange gentleness. "We saw what happened to the species that tried to resist you. We saw the patterns, how you identify threats, how you issue ultimatums, how you enforce compliance. And we decided very early in our development that when our turn came, we would be ready."
"This is impossible," Myrathal whispered. "We would have seen the construction. We would have detected the resource allocation. Our observation networks."
"See exactly what we want them to see," the Admiral interrupted, and I realized with a chill that she could hear us. our secure communications, our private discussions in the most protected chamber of our civilization. She was listening to all of it. We learned that lesson from the Cathari. They tried to hide their preparations from you and failed because they didn't understand how your surveillance worked. We spent 40 years just studying your observation methods before we began construction. Everything you've seen from humanity, the slow expansion, the primitive technology, the internal conflicts, all of it was exactly what you expected to see from a young, developing species.
A deception, Vetheron said. 3 centuries of deception.
Not deception, preparation. We didn't lie to you, First Keeper. We simply didn't show you everything. The Admiral's expression shifted, becoming more serious. We showed you the humanity you expected, the squabbling nations, the inefficient governments, the limited technology. What we didn't show you was the consensus that formed behind that facade, the agreement reached before we ever left our home system that we would never submit to external domination, never, regardless of the cost.
You would risk extinction rather than accept reasonable limitations?
You misunderstand. Admiral Okonkwo leaned forward slightly, and for the first time I saw something hard in her gentle expression, something that had survived ice ages and mass extinctions and self-inflicted catastrophes that should have ended her species a dozen times over. We are not risking anything. We are not gambling. We prepared for this moment for 300 years.
Every human who has ever lived since we discovered we were not alone in the universe has contributed to what you're seeing now. The fleet, the technology, the strategic positioning, the infiltration of your observation networks, the cultivation of alliances you never knew existed.
Alliances? Vitharan's voice cracked on the word. The display updated again, and new signatures appeared. Not human vessels, but ships bearing the markers of species we had believed to be firmly within our control. The Cathari, the Varanthi, the Myreth. 17 civilizations that had submitted to our ultimatums, that had accepted our oversight, that had been compliant members of the Grand Equilibrium for thousands of years. They were not compliant anymore. You taught the galaxy that resistance was futile, Admiral Okonkwo said. You were wrong. You taught them that submission was the only option. You were wrong about that, too. What you actually taught them was patience, how to wait, how to hide their strength, how to preserve the hope of freedom across generations until the moment when resistance became possible.
We freed them, the Admiral continued. Not through conquest, not through domination, through example. We showed them that your ultimatums could be refused. We showed them that your surveillance could be evaded. We showed them that the grand equilibrium was not a natural law of the universe, but a system maintained by force, and that force could be matched.
The tactical display now showed combined fleet strengths that dwarfed anything the Varanthi Collective could deploy. Our enforcement fleet of 300 vessels was surrounded by 47,000 human ships and accompanied by over 100,000 vessels from formerly subject species. And this was just what they were showing us. If 3 centuries of apparent weakness had concealed 300,000 warships, what else might be hidden?
So, Admiral Okonkwo said, and her voice carried no triumph, no gloating, only that strange, unsettling gentleness. Let me respond to your ultimatum properly. She rose from her seat, and I had the sense that she was speaking not just to us, but to every being in the galaxy who might be listening. You demanded that humanity cease expansion. We decline. Our people will go where they choose, settle where they wish, explore as far as their courage carries them. You demanded that we surrender territory. We decline. Every world we have claimed was empty when we found it, and we will not abandon the homes we have built.
You demanded inspection of our military. We decline. Our defenses are our own concern, and we will maintain whatever capabilities we deem necessary for our security.
You demanded a permanent overseer in our home system. We decline. Earth is not yours to monitor, and our sovereignty is not negotiable.
She paused, and when she continued, her voice softened further.
But here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to destroy you. We're not going to issue our own ultimatum demanding your submission. We're not going to become what you have been. The grand equilibrium is over, not because we're tearing it down, but because it was never sustainable. You cannot maintain order through domination forever. Eventually, someone refuses. Eventually, the dominated unite. Eventually, the system breaks.
What? Vetheran's voice was barely audible. What do you want from us?
We want you to go home, Admiral Okonkwo replied. We want you to withdraw your enforcement fleet, return to your territory, and begin the difficult work of learning how to exist in a galaxy you no longer control. We want you to discover what the Varanthi might become when they're not busy subjugating everyone else. We want you to have the opportunity to choose your own path forward, the same opportunity you've denied to every other species for 11,000 years.
You would simply let us go?
The silence that followed was different from the silence after Earth's initial refusal. This was not stunned disbelief. This was something deeper. The quiet recognition that everything we had believed about power, about stability, about the nature of galactic civilization had been wrong.
How? I heard myself asked, and was surprised to find that I had spoken aloud. How did you build all of this without our knowledge? How did you maintain unity across 3 centuries? How did you— Admiral Okonkwo's attention shifted to me, and I felt the weight of her gaze across the light years that separated us. You're Thisara Vek, aren't you? 3rd Keeper of the Equilibrium Chamber. We've read your works, your analyses of species psychological profiles, your theories about compliance conditioning. You're considered quite brilliant by your people's standards.
I did not know how to respond to this.
You asked how we maintained unity, she continued. The answer is that we didn't try to. We're not unified in the way you imagine. We don't have a single government, a single ideology, a single approach to existence. We disagree about almost everything. We argue constantly. We have conflicts and competitions and debates that never seem to end.
Then how— But there are some things we agree on. Not because anyone forced us to agree, but because we came to the same conclusions independently, across cultures and centuries and all the divisions that separate us. We agree that freedom is worth protecting. We agree that no external power has the right to dictate our destiny. We agree that when someone threatens what we hold most dear, we stand together regardless of our other differences.
She smiled again, and this time the expression reached her eyes.
You built an empire by eliminating disagreement, by enforcing uniformity, by crushing any deviation from your prescribed order. We built a civilization by embracing disagreement, by finding strength in diversity, by discovering that our differences could be sources of innovation rather than threats to stability. You looked at us and saw chaos. We looked at ourselves and saw flexibility, adaptability, the capacity to respond to challenges in ways that a more rigid system could never imagine.
I thought of the analysis I had written centuries ago, dismissing humanity as a species too divided to ever pose a significant threat. I thought of the certainty with which I had concluded that their internal conflicts would prevent them from achieving true galactic influence. I thought of all the assumptions I had made,
All the variables I had failed to consider, all the ways I had been catastrophically, fundamentally wrong.
"We underestimated you," I said.
Everyone does. It's one of our advantages. Admiral Okonkwo's expression softened further. But here's the thing, Third Keeper. We don't want you to fear us. We don't want to replace your domination with our own. We want something much more difficult. We want to build a galaxy where fear isn't the foundation of order, where species cooperate because they choose to, not because they're forced to, where the strong protect the weak instead of exploiting them.
"A galaxy without the equilibrium would be chaos," Vetherin interjected, though his voice lacked conviction.
Would it? Or would it be something new, something that hasn't existed because you've never allowed it to exist? The Admiral shook her head slowly. You've maintained your version of order for 11,000 years, and in all that time, what has the galaxy actually achieved? What discoveries have been made? What art has been created? What potential has been realized? You've kept everything stable, yes, but stable isn't the same as thriving. Stable isn't the same as alive. I found myself thinking of the species I had studied across my long career. The Cathari, who had once been renowned for their philosophical innovations, now producing nothing but compliance reports. The Voranthi, whose artistic traditions had been legendary, now creating only approved cultural content. The Myreth, whose scientists had been pushing the boundaries of physics, now merely maintaining existing systems. Stability had been achieved, yes, but at what cost?
"We need time," Vetherin said finally, "to consult, to discuss, to understand what you are proposing."
Take all the time you need, Admiral Okonkwo replied. We've waited 3 centuries. We can wait a bit longer. But while you're discussing, I want you to understand something. Her expression became very serious. We are not threatening you. We are not demanding your submission. But if you choose to continue your policy of enforcement, if you decide that the grand equilibrium must be preserved through force, you will find that the galaxy has changed.
The species you once controlled are no longer afraid. The systems you once dominated are no longer compliant. And humanity.
She paused, and in that pause I glimpsed something ancient behind her gentle expression, something forged in the fires of a dozen near extinctions, tempered by suffering that would have broken lesser species, hardened into a resolve that could not be threatened or intimidated or broken.
Humanity will be waiting, not to conquer you, not to destroy you, but to ensure that no one is ever again forced to submit to an ultimatum they did not choose. The transmission ended.
The 17 days that followed were unlike anything in Voranthi history. The equilibrium chamber, which had never in 11 millennia faced a situation it could not control, found itself paralyzed by uncertainty. Factions formed overnight, those who advocated for immediate military response despite the obvious futility, those who counseled acceptance of the new order, those who simply could not process that the galaxy had changed and retreated into denial.
I spent those days doing something I had never done before. Listening, not analyzing, not assessing, not calculating optimal responses, simply listening to the chaos of voices that filled our networks as species across the galaxy discovered that the Voranthi no longer controlled their destinies. Some panicked, fearing that without the equilibrium, ancient conflicts would resurface. Some celebrated, openly rejoicing in a freedom they had only dreamed of. Some reached out to humanity, seeking alliance, partnership,
guidance in navigating a galaxy that suddenly felt vast and uncertain and full of possibility. And humanity responded to all of them, not with ultimatums, not with demands, with conversations, with offers of assistance, with patient explanations that freedom meant exactly that, the liberty to choose one's own path, including paths that humanity might disagree with. On the 14th day, I requested permission to travel to human space. The Thorin granted it without argument. I think he was simply too overwhelmed to object. I boarded a diplomatic vessel and made the journey to Earth itself, to the origin point of the species that had shattered everything I thought I understood about galactic civilization. What I found there surprised me more than the fleet, more than the revelation of their true capabilities, more than anything I had witnessed in 11,000 years of existence. They welcomed me, not as a defeated enemy, not as a representative of a fallen power, as a guest. Admiral Okonkwo met me personally, escorting me through a human city that looked nothing like the desperate, divided communities our observations had portrayed. It was vibrant, chaotic, full of disagreement and debate, and the kind of creative energy that our carefully maintained order had systematically suppressed across 1,000 subject worlds.
"Why?" I asked her, as we walked through a public garden where humans of a dozen different phenotypes mixed freely with members of species I had believed to be under Varanthi control. Why reveal everything now? You could have continued hiding your strength, allowed us to believe our dominance was intact, avoided the crisis entirely.
"Because hiding wasn't the goal," she replied. "Preparation was the goal, and we had prepared enough."
Enough for what? Enough to ensure that when we refused your ultimatum, you would understand that it was a genuine refusal, not a bargaining position, not a desperate gamble, but a considered decision backed by sufficient capability to make it stick. She paused beside a fountain where water cascaded in patterns I did not recognize. "We didn't want to fight you, Third Keeper. We wanted to show you that fighting was unnecessary, that there could be a different way.
Your species risked everything on this moment. If your preparations had been discovered, if your deception had been revealed,
Then we would have been destroyed. Yes, we knew that from the beginning." She turned to face me, and her expression was open in a way I had never seen from a political or military leader of any species. "But we decided, as a species, that we would rather risk destruction than guarantee submission, that we would rather face the possibility of extinction than the certainty of eternal subjugation."
"That is not rational."
no, it's human." She smiled, and the expression carried warmth I had not known I was capable of perceiving. "We are not a rational species, Third Keeper. We are a stubborn species, a defiant species, a species that has looked extinction in the face more times than we can count, and responded not with submission, but with innovation, adaptation, and the absolute refusal to accept that any challenge is insurmountable."
I thought of the analyses I had read of human history, the ice ages they had survived, the plagues that had decimated their populations, the wars they had fought against each other that should have ended their civilization a dozen times over. I had interpreted these events as evidence of instability, of a species prone to self-destruction. Now I saw them differently, as a record of resilience, of a people who had been tested again and again and had refused every single time to break.
"The galaxy panicked when Earth refused," I said slowly. "But you were not afraid."
"We were terrified," Admiral Okonkwo corrected gently. "We are always terrified.
Fear is not the absence of courage, Third Keeper. It's the precondition for it. We were afraid when we first discovered we were not alone in the universe.
We were afraid when we realized what your ultimatum meant. We are afraid right now, uncertain whether the new order we've helped create will be better or worse than what came before.
Then how do you proceed? Together. She gestured at the garden around us, at the diverse gathering of humans and aliens, sharing space and conversation. Not because we have overcome our fear, but because we have learned that fear shared is fear diminished. Because we have discovered that the burdens we carry become lighter when we carry them with others.
Because we understand, in a way your species apparently never has, that true strength is not the elimination of weakness. It is the willingness to remain vulnerable while still moving forward. I stood in that garden, surrounded by a species I had dismissed as primitive and chaotic and doomed to irrelevance, and I felt something I had not experienced in 11,000 years of carefully maintained equilibrium.
Hope. Not the calculated optimism of projected outcomes, not the manufactured confidence of controlled variables. True hope, irrational, vulnerable, persistent despite all evidence that the future is uncertain and fraught with danger.
We panicked, I admitted. When Earth refused, the entire Varanthi collective panicked. For the first time in our history, we faced a situation we could not control, and we had no idea how to respond.
I know, Admiral Okonkwo said. We were counting on that. Counting on our panic?
Counting on the fact that a species which has controlled everything for 11,000 years has lost the capacity to respond to genuine uncertainty. Counting on the understanding that your power was never as absolute as you believed. It was always contingent on the compliance of those you dominated, on the fear you had cultivated in every other species. The moment that fear broke, the moment one species refused and demonstrated that refusal could succeed, your entire system began to collapse.
Not because we were stronger than you, but because we were willing to be the first.
The first to refuse. The first to refuse and survive. The first to show the galaxy that your ultimatums were not inevitable, that submission was a choice rather than a necessity, that the grand equilibrium was a system maintained by belief as much as by force. She placed a hand on my arm, a gesture of connection I would not have permitted from any being just days before. We didn't defeat you, Third Keeper. We freed you.
You've been as trapped by your system as any species you've dominated, trapped in the role of enforcer, unable to imagine any other way of existing in the galaxy. Now you have the chance to discover who the Varanthi might become when you're not busy controlling everyone else.
On the 17th day, I returned to the equilibrium chamber with a recommendation that would have been unthinkable less than a month before. Acceptance. Not of defeat, not of submission, but of change. The grand equilibrium had ended, not in the catastrophic collapse we had feared, but in a transformation that offered possibilities we had never imagined.
Vetherin listened to my report in silence. When I finished, he remained still for a long moment.
You believe we should simply accept this? Accept that 11,000 years of order was wrong?
I believe, I said carefully, that we should accept the opportunity to learn. The humans are not our enemies, First Keeper. They do not want our destruction. They want our participation in a new kind of galactic civilization, one built on cooperation rather than domination, on mutual benefit rather than enforced compliance.
And if they are deceiving us, If this offer of partnership is merely another layer of their 3-century deception.
Then we will discover that in time. But I have spent 11,000 years analyzing species for vulnerabilities, for weaknesses to exploit, for pressure points to manipulate. When I look at humanity now, I see something I have never seen before, a species with nothing to hide. They have revealed their strength, they have explained their methods, they have offered terms that ask nothing of us except the willingness to change.
If this is deception, it is a deception so total that it is indistinguishable from truth.
The vote in the equilibrium chamber was not unanimous. Nothing in Varanthi governance ever was, but the majority accepted what was ultimately inevitable. The galaxy had changed, and we could either change with it or be left behind.
That was 30 years ago.
I no longer carry the title of third keeper of the equilibrium chamber. The chamber itself has been transformed, no longer a center of control and enforcement, but a research institution dedicated to understanding the new galactic order that has emerged from humanity's refusal. We study cooperation now instead of compliance, partnership instead of domination, the complex dynamics of a galaxy where species interact as equals rather than as masters and subjects.
It is more difficult than the old way. More uncertain, more chaotic in exactly the ways we once feared. But it is also more alive, more creative, more full of potential than anything the grand equilibrium ever produced.
Earth refused the ultimatum, and the galaxy panicked. But panic, I have learned, is not always a prelude to catastrophe. Sometimes it is the beginning of awakening, the jarring disruption that forces a system out of comfortable stagnation and into the turbulence of genuine change.
I visit Earth regularly now, walking the gardens where Admiral Okonkwo first taught me that fear and hope could coexist, that strength and vulnerability were not opposites, that the greatest power in the universe is not the ability to dominate others, but the willingness to stand with them.
The humans have a saying I have come to appreciate. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. For 11,000 years, we planted forests of control, cultivating compliance like crops, harvesting obedience from every species we encountered. We believed we were building something permanent, an equilibrium that would last forever.
Earth refused our ultimatum, and we discovered that forever is an illusion, that every system carries the seeds of its own transformation, that the only true equilibrium is one that allows for growth.
The galaxy panicked, and then, slowly, carefully, together, we began to build something new.
We are still building. We will always be building. That, I have learned, is what it means to be alive, not to achieve a final state of perfect order, but to continue growing, changing, adapting, reaching toward possibilities that cannot yet be imagined.
Earth refused the ultimatum.
And the galaxy finally learned to hope.